The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Restructuring and Reimagining Digital Collections. I am Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Jennifer O'Brien-Roper and Ellen Catz Ramsey, both at the University of Virginia Library in Charlottesville, Virginia. Jennifer is the Director for Digital Strategies. She received her MSLS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has spent 20 years working in academic libraries to connect scholars to resources. Ellen is the Director for Scholarly Repository Services. She received her MLIS from Florida State University and her Master's in Education from the University of Virginia, and works to make scholarly content generated by and for the UVA community openly accessible whenever possible. Both bring much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have them with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for the presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here's Jennifer. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Roper, and I'm here with my colleague Ellen Ramsey to discuss work that we have been working on at the University of Virginia for the last couple of years to evaluate and overhaul our internal library workflows to create and disseminate digital content. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to be covering here, we're going to talk a little bit about the legacy of digital collecting at UVA, what led us to decide that we needed to make a change, how we have built a new foundation, and then moving on to implementation and the iteration, which is the phase that we are at now. From its inception, UVA has had a strong record of decentralization, as well as faculty and staff that desire to lead in their respective fields. For the library, these factors led to great collaborations in groundbreaking digital collections and support for digital humanities in the late 90s, very early days for these efforts. These collaborations were built around individual relationships and often came without formalized agreements. It was the Wild West of digital collections, and everyone was saddled up and along for the ride. What this screen is showing you is just some screenshots from those early efforts, some generating within the library and others with faculty or collaborative partners throughout the university. While this individual and informal approach led to innovation, it also led away from scalability and replicability. Essentially, over the course of 2 decades, we found ourselves with a great cache of content and unclear expectations for management and little infrastructure to harness our previous work in service of completing new projects more quickly. To be certain, we have had intermittent successes, and these successes tended to mask critical issues with communication and transparency when the result was reached that was satisfactory to many. In essence, each digital collection was custom designed and the workflows varied by project. This led to high satisfaction among curators and frustration among description and technology experts left to maintain a project that may or may not conform to their workflows or fit within their resources. The need for remediation has been high as systems predictably changed, and the unclear expectations for long-term management have created a tension-filled environment, particularly when there is mention of decommissioning a project, as it is unclear what was promised, what is expected. We occasionally hear from some constituents who are very committed to the projects that they owned or were involved with, and then there are others that we don't hear from, and we're not sure if the silence is somebody's lack of interest in it continuing on, or if it's decommissioned, we're going to hear right away. Accountability and authority have been ill-defined, and we were attempting to bring new content into a system that felt held together in a way that we could not maintain. So the solution that we came upon in 2017 was the need to assemble a team. At that point, we had several staff members who were trying to forge communications between themselves as individuals to try and resolve some of the issues. And it got them part of the way, but it was not resolving the larger issues. So the library senior administration decided that we should bring together a group. And the group had a charge to articulate and document consistent and replicable workflows designed to ingest digital content. We were sure to include expertise from all aspects of our digital projects workflow. So that meant acquisitions, digitization, metadata, dissemination, preservation, and special collections all had a seat at the table. You may notice that we did not have anybody from public services or our subject experts listed in that group. And that was intentional, as we wanted to bring together the people who were going to have to do the work to talk about what was scalable, what could be resourced for, and come up with our ideal. And then after that, take it out to the rest of the library to start a conversation about where we needed to go. So this group met over the course of 2 months with a weekly commitment for meeting. We began with a brainstorming session to allow everyone to articulate their questions and concerns as it occurred to them. We followed that with focused discussions on the current methods, requirements, stakeholders, procedures, and documentation for each step of the workflow. And after that, we did turn to benchmarking, and members conducted a survey of programs and documentation from other institutions that could provide us with examples of good practice. As the group's leader, I synthesized the discussions that we had had to that point and created a rubric to evaluate the current practices and needs. So over the course of 1 or 2 meetings per workflow step, we rigorously analyzed current practice, documentation, tool, and communication needs. Sometimes we were talking about what we were currently doing. Sometimes we were talking about what was needed. They didn't always overlap in the way that we would like, and that was where we were generating discussion. We were disciplined about using a parking lot in our notes to keep discussions focused on the area that we were talking about, but not forget important observations that had come out that we were going to discuss at another stage in the workflow. At the end of 2 months, we reviewed those notes and distilled out key principles that had surfaced time and again throughout our discussions. Our resulting report included the key principles that we had determined were necessary for successful digital library workflow, as well as 13 specific recommendations. So as I noted, we defined principles that we would need to follow to achieve success. First came the idea of standardization, and this came out in almost every aspect of our discussion. Our bespoke approach to each digital project came at a high planning and/or remediation cost, and often caused projects to stall midstream. We thought that standardization could allow us to reuse decisions and tools. And this may seem obvious to anyone who is involved with the standard print workflows in a library, and there were certainly people around the table that had that thought, this is so easy for us with print, why are we having to talk about this again? And we just decided that we needed to take a page from our own book and really commit to standardization. We also talked about establishing a workflow and resourcing it. We spent a lot of time discussing staffing. Every organization has finite resources. We determined that it's necessary to be honest about those resources, both money and staff, and adjust expectations for output accordingly. So in our report, we discussed that what kind of output we saw could come from current staffing, and that if a higher output was desired, that more positions would be needed, and we outlined where those positions would be. We talked about communication. So in my experience, every workflow can always improve communication. This was a primary principle for us, the need to routinize communication in order to create a shared understanding of our goals and the work that was being done to accomplish those goals. Finally, hand in hand with communication is documentation. It can be more fun to do innovative work than write about it afterwards. We all know that. Having been frustrated time and again by our own lack of documentation, though, we felt it was important to change our own habits and make a commitment to documenting what we planned to do as well as what we did do. So as I mentioned, we had 13 very specific recommendations, and I'm not going to run through the laundry list of those recommendations. I've sort of distilled them out to the categories that we came up with. Some were around staffing and resourcing, such as creating the digital collections team to spend further time focused on enacting the change that we had been plotting out during this time. In addition to the team, we recommended that at least one position be dedicated to coordinating these workflows. Our previous practice of everyone giving some time to digital projects meant that it was nobody's focus, and it showed with the issues that we were having. The majority of the recommendations identified workflows in need of tools or systems for document storage that was non-email based communication and tracking of progress. We were very clear to not recommend specific tools or systems in this report. We wanted to keep it very high level and focus on where such tools were needed and leave it to a group of experts to determine what tools would meet the need. After the recommendations, the report outlined a possible workflow that created more comprehensive review and planning stages in advance of work than had been undertaken to date. The working group presented this report to senior leadership and then to the full library. It was well received, and the digital collections team was commissioned soon thereafter in late 2017. And by summer 2018, my role had been changed to dedicate my time to the coordination of digital collections, primarily at this point trying to get all of this off the ground, as we are talking about some pretty significant changes to our culture and to our practice. I'm now going to hand it over to Ellen to talk to you about how we have been implementing these changes.
We are actually in the same room, so the moving around that you hear was us switching spots. Hi, I'm Ellen Ramsey, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've implemented the recommendations of the report that Jennifer was introducing. In addition to values of accountability, which she mentioned, values of transparency were also really, really important to this particular project and to many projects in the library in general. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to employ some tools that were widely used in our environment and that would be openly and available to track for anyone in the project, but also folks outside of the project to see what we were doing. And the scary part about open tools is that they highlight values of accountability. So when we make it visible for everyone to see what we're doing and who's responsible for what, that can be intimidating at the outset. But one of the things that the team has really worked on is to be comfortable with assigning each other tasks, passing them back and forth, discussing when we're running into problems, and calling in other resources when we need to. And so we have those values, and I'll talk a little bit more about what expert areas we pulled in and how we manage that. But before I go into screen captures of our particular project management tool and how we're doing this with this particular project, I want to really reiterate that just because we use a particular approach, because it fit what Jennifer described as having been defined as the needs of this particular project, it doesn't matter what the tool is. The goals are important. The direction of where we needed to go was much more important than whatever tool we selected. And keeping in mind project values and where we're heading when we're selecting tools, whether those be a project management tool, whether it be a tool for content and delivery and dissemination of the actual digital collections, those all matter. More importantly, they all matter what how they serve the values of our project rather than is it pretty, is it easy? And so one of the things that as a project manager I often get asked about is, well, what tool should I use? And it doesn't really matter. So we're going to talk about JIRA, which is a particular instance that we have here at UVA. A lot of other places use it in higher ed and in industry. But if you don't happen to have that particular tool at your disposal, don't worry about it. There are many, many ways to get from the overview of a project to the completion of it, many tools, but as long as you know where you're going and where you want to end up, how you track that isn't as important. That said, we wanted to use tools that people were familiar with because that was a hurdle that we didn't have to overcome with something that was already in our environment. So we wanted to integrate with existing workflows, and there's already wide use of this particular tool in our environment from the team that was doing the development, which was our digital content management team, from our very robust user experience team in our web environment, in the discovery layer project, which I manage. We are already using this same way of tracking projects. So it helps to be able to adopt that and to leverage expertise that was in-house on how to use this particular tool. But again, I'll say this again, that the accountability, the transparency, the need to document is consistent, and the particular tool that we chose was the one that suited our needs the best, but there were other choices we could have made, and you could do what we are discussing with many other less expensive tools. I'm going to turn over to Jennifer for a moment because the next slide is really an implementation of how this tool actually fit our needs, but how important it was that we had defined what the process was before we started running it through the particular tool.
So what you're looking at here is a workflow document that actually comes out of the JIRA system, and each of these boxes is a step within the workflow that will require us to interact with that system to make documentation of some sort of a decision of work being done. And this is probably the third iteration that we are on with this. So what you can see here is you start at open, and we wanted to populate the system with projects that had already been completed, that were not going to be up for decision making, because we understand that we wanted to create documentation around what had been done, but also somebody in the future might want to create enhancement to a particular project or site that had been worked on. And so with this already in the system, you would be able to go from disseminated, where all of our legacy projects went, straight down to proposed. So essentially what happens is somebody creates what is called a ticket. So they describe what the project is, and then they can say, I'd like to propose a project around this. And in proposing a project, you're citing specific work that you would like done, be it to something that has already been worked on or something new. And at the point of proposal, there is much work that needs to be done. There are reviews that have to be completed for IP restrictions, learning about those. We want to learn a little bit more about the content and how it fits in with our collecting priorities as a library. We want to learn about metadata and preservation and dissemination and digitization, and how much work it's going to take from each of the teams to make this proposed project work. And I will say that this is a step that we have been stuck on for some time in terms of the review, because people were uncertain what to put in their reviews. We had to have one of many conversations about this. This is not your magnum opus. Just give your thoughts on, is this something that we can do, or is this something that we need more thought upon? I think it's clearer for people in the area of IP. Do we have the clearance to work on this or not? But with other things, so for instance, with metadata, there was a sense of, do I have to tell you exactly the plan for this? And we ended up on, after many conversations saying, no, you don't need to know what the plan is. Do you think this is content that we can work with?
And we'll show some examples of actual reviews that were done on projects so you can get a sense of the type of language, the length of input that people were doing, to see where we found things run smoothly and where we got caught up.
Yeah. And so after proposed projects will move to the approved phase, and that doesn't mean that we're going to work on it right away. It just means that we have said, yes, this is something that we can work on. I'll tell you right now, if you looked at JIRA here, you would see that we have 20 projects in the approved phase. That does not mean that we are going to start working on 20 projects anytime soon. It's just those have cleared the hurdle of, yes, we can work on that. And now we're on to the hard work of trying to prioritize those. After approval, things move to acquired. And I don't know if other places have this issue, but one of the things that we've had to work on here for acquired is actually keeping track of our MOUs and deeds of gift on collections, and making sure that we understand what we agreed to do and what other people are expecting from us. So this has also been a big culture shift for us to start to keep documentation with a project with regard to how we got the content in the first place. And then pretty soon after acquired, we hit another milestone for us, and that is the pre-planning. So I mentioned that our process ended up putting all of this review and planning up front, and it's been uncomfortable for us to really hold our feet to the fire and get this done. In fact, we had a meeting just this week to discuss planning and how could we get it done in a way that was holding ourselves accountable to what we all agreed was good practice, coming up with a plan ahead of time, knowing that it would be iterative, that things might change along the way, but making it lightweight enough that people felt like they could commit to it. So that's where we are with a lot of projects. After being acquired, it goes into the queue. And that would essentially mean that if this is something that needs description work, that it is going to be sitting in line waiting for description work. So some projects could sit there for a while if there's a backlog of description that needs to be done. But we do have some collections that are already described, so we can move them on through described. Maybe so then they have to go to digitization. But because we're dealing with a lot of legacy stuff right now, we have a number of things that are already digitized. So it really feels like they're sailing through the system once we can get past those pre-planning phases. And then ultimately it goes to dissemination and preservation before we will say that things are done. So I will say we haven't reached an endpoint with any project yet. I think we're close with the first two projects that we decided to work on using this workflow. And I need to be thinking about what do we do once it's under preservation, because I'd like us to be reviewing. So we've been doing a lot of review of the process while we're in it, but I'd also like to review it at the end so that we can say, okay, we held ourselves accountable to doing the reviews and doing the plans, and did it make it better at the end? And I'm curious to find out if it is the result that we're hoping for.
Jennifer was gracious while I was drawing on the screen. I don't even know if you guys could see that. So what we wanted to show you as well is, if we can get to the next slide. There. That one. Yeah. What we wanted to show you is what it looks like to describe a particular project. And these are, large things. You can look at this particular project that we're describing, which is a collection of oral histories that were done in Charlottesville, and they're in a variety of formats. And we wanted to refresh them and make them more current and make them more accessible. But there were a lot of issues to resolve. This is a typical project for us in a lot of ways. That, hey, we have records for the collection, but not for the individual oral histories. Some of them are recorded, some of them are transcripts. Some of them we have clear rights to in terms of people gave us permission to record them, and in other cases, well, UVA owns the rights to this collection. It was done by a person who was in the employment of the university at the time, so we can probably use it. But those are sort of what we were going in with, and that used to be kind of all we knew about a project when we were asked to do it. So that's where we started with this one. But very quickly what you find out is gosh, there's some issues here that we need clarity on. And the other issue that Jennifer alluded to is that, you know, whether it's us 10 years from now or somebody else 10 years from now, nobody's going to remember what we decided about this unless we really do a good job documenting it. So this particular approach has made it easier for us to document. So what happens as we go through the project, and this is an example of yet another project that we have in the queue. This one is about a 19th century newspaper. So what you see is under the workflow tab, right on this description page, you see the things that we need to accomplish before we can even seriously consider putting this project in the queue, right? If the stuff has already been digitized, then we can provide an inventory of what's been digitized. If not, then we need to do the digitization. Beyond the initial, like, I think we have rights to this, we do a full rights assessment. And, you know, sometimes that's just simply, this was work for hire and we don't need further documentation. Or, you know, it can be, golly, we need permission from every single author in this collected works, and in order to be completely certain, how much risk are we willing to tolerate? And we happen to be very fortunate here with a pretty risk-accepting environment, but, you know, there are places that have less tolerance for that. So your mileage may vary on that one. But the description is what you're looking at now. The digitization, if the stuff isn't already in a format that we can use, we have to plan for that. The dissemination plan is, okay, what container is it going to be available in, and how is it going to be organized when people get to it? And then preservation is the very last step of that. The last point that you see under there on the undo acquire, Jennifer, you guys added that recently, right?
Yeah, we did recently add in a bunch of opportunities to take it back to the previous step. It primarily came about because there was a project that we all wanted to approve, but we weren't able to because it was actually just a project in theory. There was no content with the project, and we were stuck with it in the place of, well, do we approve it knowing there's nothing to do? So what do we do about that? Or do we deny it knowing it's something that we want to do? So denial sounds harsh and incorrect for what we wanted to do. So we pushed it. We said, okay, well, we need to be able to push it back to open, and then decided, well, you know, we might come across this circumstance in other cases where something comes up and we don't want to scrap the whole project, but we need to push it back to the previous step to backtrack and do some more work.
So as we go through the process, what happens with our expert assignments in each of these areas, what has worked really well with this project is, because of our values of accountability, it's been a little bit of a culture change to say, you're going to do this part, you particular person. I actually took the names off so that we wouldn't out anybody for having stuff in progress versus resolved. But each of these subtasks has someone who is experienced and credible in that area to be able to do the review. So content review is done by a subject specialist. IP review is done by one of us who has an understanding of licensing and rights. Metadata review is done by folks with expertise in that area. The digitization review happens from somebody, a representative from our digitization team. The dissemination review happens from our developer team. And then the preservation review is done by our preservation librarian. And so we've identified people's skills and made them accountable for filling in the blanks on their particular area and documenting that, so that when we have a project that gets stuck because of a particular issue, we know where it got stuck and what the issue is that needs to be resolved before it can move forward. And we're not continuing to say, for example, digitize things for which we don't have the rights. This is just an example of a particular detail of an assignment review. I picked the IP review because I've done a lot of those, and so I didn't want to embarrass anybody else with what they had written. And in this particular case, it was a pretty easy rights review, which is, these were before 1923. Guess what? They're in the public domain, no rights issues. And whether we create transcripts or OCR of the digitized content or not, it doesn't matter. This is public domain work. So this was, an unusually straightforward case. Nothing is ever this easy, but I just wanted to show you that it does work. So I'm going to move on and let Jennifer come back and help me talk about what lessons we've learned and what this means for work that the team is now doing. One of the things I'll say very quickly that we've learned is sometimes people who are tasked with particular project tasks end up not being the ideal person to do that. So Jennifer talked about her role. I've actually transitioned to a less actively involved role with the team at this point, because we were finding that some of the work that I was doing, which was intellectual property review, needed to be done by somebody who had more expertise. And so I found myself taking lots and lots of questions to my colleague whose job that really is, as opposed to mine, who only does it a little bit, and asking that be a more central part of his role. And that has been enabled by the existence of this team and the structure and the very clear delineation of tasks.
I would say that's a good summation of what for me is the biggest thing to take away from this, and that is be comfortable with iteration and in fact be open to it. As I mentioned, in general, expert review, planning, and general accountability have been our biggest learning curve, and this was not something that was a big surprise to us, but it's been as hard as we thought it would be. So as I mentioned, when we initially set things out, we said in 2017, reviewing and planning, these are key things that we need to be doing before we start working. And we actually did some work over the fall, and we did not hold ourselves accountable to tracking that work in the JIRA system. So there were projects that are currently sitting at acquired in the system that we know they're actually much further down the line, and they got hung up on the reviews or at the planning stage. And so, as I mentioned, we had a meeting this week to talk about, okay, what are we going to do about this? When we initially got hung up at the review stage, probably back in October or November, so a few months into this, we had our first meeting of, okay, what are we going to do about this? Do we want to do what we said we were going to do? And we talked about, well, what is the expectation for this review? What should it look like? And how long do I have to get it done? Because some people were thinking it needed to be the best articulated plan that they had ever written. Some people thought they had to get it done within 24 hours. And what we came around to was do your best based on the information that you have. And if you need to kick it back to somebody or you have more questions, don't complete your review, right? I'm consulting with this person to get more information. And we also determined, based on input from curators, subject liaisons, and others, that we could take about a month to look at a proposal. That this did not need to be on a rush turnaround time where you must drop everything and do your metadata review or look into the IP situation with a particular project, but you can take a month, and that should give you the time to meet with the people that you needed to meet with and get answers for your questions. And that honestly, if a month wasn't enough time, to go ahead and put that in there and note that more time was needed. That we don't want to sacrifice good practice in the name of speed, and we want to let the transparency and the documentation work for us as we're working through this stage. So again, we reached this problem again with pre-planning this week, and I brought to the team, okay, in 2017 we said we needed to plan ahead of time, and we ended up deciding that there were 3 ways that we could work with pre-planning. We could either have individuals, so the metadata representative could do plans for the 20 projects that we approved, or we could have a project manager come on for a few projects and gather the information from all of the people, metadata, digitization, preservation, but have one person whose job it was to collect all of that information. Or we could push the planning off until just before each phase. I was very proud of the team that everybody agreed. We knew what we were talking about when we said that the planning should be done up front. So we needed to do that. We needed to figure out how to do that. So for right now, we're going with let's have project managers for 6 of these projects who are going to go around and see how they can get that planning done. We said, let's try this over the next couple of weeks, and then we're going to come back together. And if it seemed like that worked, then we'll probably move forward with that as our way of working. And if it didn't work, then we'll either try the other methodology that we thought about or come up with something else. But I think the key thing is that we are all recognizing that we're experimenting with this, that we know our goal is to have planning and documentation ahead of time, and that we might need to try a couple of different ways to make that happen. I also wanted to note that another thing that we've had discussion about is documenting the absence of work. So part of the issues that we found in documentation is when we can't find out any information, because as best as I can suspect at that time, they said, oh, we're not going to digitize this at this time, or it came in digitized, so I don't need to write anything about it. And so we've come up with the tenet of, even if there is no work to be done in your area, write that in the plan. So if there's no description that needs to be done because these are already cataloged, put that in the plan. Look at that, you finish the plan in 2 minutes and you can move on. And now, whether it's for our purposes in a couple of months, a couple of years, or the people who come in and work on these materials after us, they know that we were going off of the MARC records that were in existence at the time. So whatever their issue is, they can now move on to the source of information that they needed. You know, in essence, historically, doing the work has not been problematic for UVA. As I mentioned, we have a cache of content that we're looking at. Communicating and documenting has been hard, and that has borne out in making these changes. I have found it helpful to have a tool to make us go back and redo what, you know. So as I said, over the course of the fall, we worked on a couple of projects and didn't keep up with it in Jira, and then I came in and said, okay, we didn't do that, and the tool is the one that reminded me and sort of held me accountable to, that's what the expectation of me is that I'm going to be documenting this here, so I need to turn that around into the expectation that I have from you. And I think that having someone like me in this role focused on digital collections has also been a key for us to have this ability to hold ourselves accountable and change our practice.
That's the end of our formal presentation. And so we're going to turn it back to...
Yeah, I think Amanda is going to help us with the questions.
Yes. Great, both of you. This has been a really interesting session. I think especially as our digital collections and our digital work has really matured, and also has gotten to be, you know, we have ones that have been sitting there since early in internet and online, and I think a lot of people are wrestling with this idea of, you know, what do we do with these projects that are really sort of untenable now, but the content is still appropriate. So I think this was very timely. I just want to tell everybody that if you have not yet done so, please type any questions you have into the question box, and I will relay them to the presenters. And a couple questions that, one is, it sounds like you have a very robust team with a lot of people. What are some suggestions for scaling this idea down to a smaller organization, maybe with fewer tools and fewer hats, but kind of the same needs?
So this is Jennifer. The first thing that occurs to me is to figure out who is involved with the work and who needs to be involved in these discussions. So in our case, you're right, we do have the fortune of having a number of distinct units who can focus on various aspects of this workflow. But we've also made deliberate decisions about who is involved and who isn't involved. And I think in a couple of months' time, we will probably reevaluate membership on the team. So as Ellen mentioned, she's stepped away from it in favor of somebody else. So that idea of iteration comes back in here. So I would say look around your organization, who needs to be involved with this work, and bring those people in, and just keep listening to that group in terms of, is there somebody who needs to be here, or is there somebody who's here and doesn't need to be?
I would also say that even if you don't have as many individuals as we do, the tasks still need to be done. And just because certain particular individuals are doing a particular task at this point, we all know that we could pretty confidently do some of the other tasks on the list. And so, and in fact, that has happened. You know, when we've had people out for a period, other people have covered those tasks. And so you may not have a separate digitization team from your dissemination team. That's okay. You still need to figure out how you're going to get the stuff into the format that you need it to be in, and then how you're going to share it with people. And so those are still distinct tasks, whether you have a separate person to do them or not. And I think that's actually a good reminder for us that we tend to identify, oh, only so-and-so can do that. But the truth is, you know, it's not that specialized. In a lot of ways, what we're doing is just that it's convenient for us to tag that by an identity. You know, it certainly could be. Jennifer is very capable. She could, you know, do many of the tasks that are in there, perhaps not as perfectly or as thoroughly as, you know, the specialized expert that we've designated. But, you know, for small projects, for things that have been sitting around for a while, or things that we can ascertain there's a lot already done, we could move them through that way. So that's a good reminder.
Yeah, and I would also say, to the point of, even if it's the same person doing multiple tasks, really setting out what the workflow should look like. So in the 2017 group, one of the key things that we found was, for a variety of reasons, we had fallen into a habit of digitizing first and describing later, and it was making it difficult to make things available because we didn't have any description upon which to hang things to make them available. And that led to frustration from constituents who are like, well, you digitized it, why isn't it available? And so we've said, no, we need to describe things before we digitize them. So even if it's the same person doing multiple tasks, if you're set on the order in which they are best done in your organization, then that can also help drive you towards success, and also towards that accountability of, you know, we set it out this way, did that work? Let's keep doing it this way, or where do we need to make changes?
And it's also really, really clear where the stopping points are. You know, we're consistent and clear about what are the requirements to move something forward, and we can now much more easily tell what's missing or what's wrong. And we can focus work on either resolving that problem or make the really hard decision of saying, we can't resolve that problem. This particular project is not going to go forward because of this reason.
Yeah.
Great. No, that's a great answer. A couple questions have been coming in. About how many projects are you managing at once?
That's a good question. So we have 2 that are in the later phases now. So these are the 2 that we worked on in the fall and didn't do a good job of keeping our documentation up. We were working on more, but those were the 2 that sort of were able to run through their paces and reach an endpoint. So as I mentioned, we have approved 20, and what we did this week was we identified 6 and assigned someone in and try and get the plans to keep moving forward with it. I don't believe that we're going to move forward with 6 over the course of the spring in terms of active development, but once we have those plans, we'll have some information in terms of which of these can we move forward with. We might be able to work on all 6. We were trying to choose some projects that some of the work had already been done, so that we can kind of spread the love out across the stages of the workflow. So at the moment, I guess I would say we've got 2 that we're trying to finish up and 6 that we've got in a planning phase to figure out what we're going to be working on for the remainder of the spring.
Okay. Someone asked if they said that you had showed the Valley of the Shadows and the IATH at the beginning of as examples. Have the workflows been applied to these projects yet, or mostly to newer projects?
So to be honest, well, those particular projects, I don't think, well, actually, I'm sorry, I did have a Japanese text initiative, and that is one of the things that is on our approved list. So yes, it is actually a lot of legacy things that are on our list because we didn't have these best practices, and they fell into this hole of what did we agree to maintain? What does that look like? We need to get these into a framework to be able to work on them. And sadly, the one that I mentioned, the project that I mentioned that we needed to create this ability to move from proposed back to open because there wasn't actually any content, was a new project that we were all very excited to work on, and would still welcome it with open arms and probably prioritize it as something new. We hoped in time, in time, I mean like in the next couple of months maybe, that if we can get this up and running and really share with our colleagues how it's working, that
Are you there, Jennifer? I think your sound might have gone out. Please bear with us. Jennifer? Bear with us. This is live as it happens, so sometimes there's technical difficulties. Again, you can keep putting questions into the box. We're restarting, I think, so bear with us. Should just be another moment. Jennifer, are you back? Okay, they're going to log out and log back in.
Are we back?
Yes, I can hear you, Jennifer.
I'm so sorry about that. Like halfway through my answer, it popped up saying that my audio connection had been lost.
It's live theater here.
So I'm happy to pick up if anybody wants to let.
Man, that was a great answer that Jennifer just gave too.
I'm happy to pick up where I left off or move on.
Let's move on.
Okay.
Because one of the questions also was how you differentiate workflow that is ongoing projects that go on indefinitely versus finite projects, and do you manage them differently, or do you sort of treat everything as a one-off project?
So we are actually trying to get to a point where we do, from the digital library perspective, treat things as finite projects. But what that means is that we end up handing it over to our IT group or to preservation, depending on what kind of work we're talking about, for that long-term maintenance with a clear understanding of whether or not there is an end date on that and what the expectations are. So that's why we're tracking things in JIRA as well, because we recognize that something in turn, while it's in this long-term maintenance phase, may come back up as needing some kind of work or attention from the digital collections team, or there may be some kind of enhancement, so we can resurrect that ticket and have that work again. But we are trying to get away from having things that we view from the digital library perspective as being indefinite, and really identify what phases in the workflow are they long-term maintenance, and make sure that we hand it off to those teams appropriately.
Sure. How are you estimating levels of effort for various phases of the project, such as description or digitization? And that may also lend itself to the question of how detailed do you get into your projects or into your plans?
So this is the phase that we're at with a lot of things right now. But what I did ask from description, digitization, dissemination, and preservation was to give me a low, medium, high, or unknown designation. Low meaning it would take 1 week or less. Medium meaning it would take about a month. And then high being anything more than a month's worth of effort at 40 hours a week to complete the tasks. And unknown if that could not be assessed due to other factors, and with those factors being articulated. So we're looking at a week, a month, and then beyond that in terms of level of effort.
Okay. Does the description plan particularly provide a list of the required elements and standards followed? Does it get that detailed?
Yes, we are looking for that because, again, if you'll recall way back almost an hour ago, I talked about standardization as one of our principles. We want to make sure that we are standardizing things, so that plan should get easier each time the metadata team needs to write up the description plan, because it should be plugging into something that they've already created.
Okay. What system are you using for the public discovery of digitized materials?
So we have a Blacklight instance that is on top of our ILS, as well as other, so we have Fedora and a number of things underneath, but essentially it's Blacklight that we're using. And Ellen could tell you all about that.
I can. That's actually a project that I work on. That's a whole other webinar, though.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the questions kind of that I had particularly was you talked earlier, about an hour ago, about your decommissioning of projects. Have you actually decommissioned projects in their entirely without reusing or going through any kind of process for my team?
We have not successfully done that yet. We have some ideas on what this might mean, though. So there have been meetings over the course of the fall, particularly with faculty members, because this is where we've run into this issue primarily, to figure out what does that look like if we decommission something, because we don't want to just pull the plug and say this scholarship is gone forever. We've talked about having people deposit it in our institutional repository, or coming up with some other solution for the library to provide the ability for a user to pull up perhaps an old website and be able to access it without us actually hosting it. So that might be another webinar that we can do in another year,
Yeah,
or how to decommission.
And I would also encourage attention to software preservation efforts. I mean, that's definitely something that we're working on here at UVA, and I know that it is a national priority. And the interplay of how you take a legacy digital project and make it archivable and accessible is something that digital collections has been dealing with since digital collections started. But we don't have the answer to that today, but it's certainly something that we are aware of.
And do you have any other thoughts, or have you attempted to reach out to stakeholders that haven't made themselves known about the possibly precariousness of their digital collections or the projects that they have? I know you've probably had ones come to you with worries.
Right. You're asking about, proactively looking at a particular project and saying this thing looks at risk.
So I have seen, we do have a site on our Confluences where what we use as a staff intranet, and there is a page where we are trying to basically create a list of what are all of those things that we need to have that conversation about. Who within the library knows anything about it, what can they share, and who was the original owner. So we haven't had those conversations, but we're trying to sort of get our ducks in a row to be able to go out and have that conversation.
Great. And I suspect these conversations will be happening, especially as you mentioned, the software just no longer being being usable. That there's going to be projects that are going to need to be taken down and revisited, and I think stakeholders haven't figured out yet that they're going to be asked, and trying to figure out kind of the conversation you need to have to then maybe be able to wrap them into this process that you've started.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things that we've done for a long time, and I don't know whether this is the best approach or not, is to prioritize the content over the container, right? And that often is an archiving decision or a preservation decision of, just because it was delivered with Flash in 1997, my date's wrong, doesn't mean that the content is now no longer any good, but the delivery mechanism certainly isn't. And so making that separation is something that, I know everyone who works on digital library projects has struggled with.
Well, that is all the time we have for questions today. I think we got through all of them. We're glad you could be with us today. Everyone will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable, and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and the recording. You will now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I want to again thank our presenters, Jennifer O'Brien-Roper and Ellen Catz Ramsey, and thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Catherine Balick, Joseph Nicholson, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. We have several more webinars this spring, including Determining Success of DDA and EBA with Assessment, and then also a 5-part series on research and publication basics. See the ALCTS website to register or to find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on February 12th on weeding in both academic and public libraries. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.